narratives are the water in which we swim. And I think being able to articulate very clearly, even if, uh, even if you don't have a clear action, simply knowing, wow, this is really, really being promoted quite heavily, that there are terrorists in our midst and we need to do something about them.
There is truth with a little t in all, I'd say almost all narratives. Right? There is, right? There is a crime problem in cities. There are assaults on federal personnel and property. All these things are true, but then the story creates a truth of its own.
I'm Matt Zeigler. Today, I've got Ben Hunt and Rusty Guinn with me. We're going to examine what we're calling the full circle of political narratives. We're looking at National Guard deployment justifications as a case study and how it illustrates how government uses narrative to prepare the public for actions they've already decided to take. Rusty, you first. You ready to dive in with this?
I'm ready to go.
This is a weighty topic. So, Ben, we're going to start with you because this connects directly to your academic work. I'm referencing Getting to War, where you identified how governments mobilize domestic public opinion before taking risky actions. And I want to call out the ET original note that you put up, Letters from a Birmingham Museum, where you highlighted how state portrayed civil rights activists as criminals to keep the broader public from supporting them. Talk to us a little bit about this research and those notes and why they're so relevant right now.
Sure. Well, the academic work, Getting to War, is honestly part of the origin story for what we do here at Perscient. And it's the idea that you can get information from unstructured data, what gets published, what we read, what we hear, what's being told to us. And information in the sense that motivations from the author come through. We often talk here about, why am I reading this now? As a way to create or maintain some critical distance with what you read. That when you read something, you say, well, why am I reading this now? Why is this message being presented to me as news or as truth or as even an opinion that I should take seriously? And the answer to that, I was going to say always, I'll say almost always, very often, the answer to that is that the author and the interest that the author serves, and that's not being, mean or bad. If you work for the government, the government has a point of view that wants to get across. If you work for a company, the company has a point of view they want to get across. What I'm saying is that you can measure and analyze that effort to mobilize public opinion, to nudge the reader in one direction or another through what's been said. And the academic research, this is a long time ago now, this is in the 90s when I was doing this work, but the basic idea is that before a government would do something risky, like start a war with another country, you would naturally want to try to bring public opinion along to your way of thinking. And turns out that's true, whether you're talking about a democracy, a monarchy, a dictatorship, communist country, a capitalist country. All governments that I was able to analyze over a period of 150 years, they all make the effort. It's the effort. And one of the things that has played out in our current research, which is light years beyond what we were able to do in the 90s, is that when you're looking for these efforts to mobilize public opinion, you want to look for not descriptive words, not, oh, this is happening, but you're looking for prescriptive words. This should happen, or you should think of these people in a certain way. It's the should that's important. That's what pushes us. That's what nudges us. And that led to the Epsilon Theory note I wrote Well, as it was the first one we wrote after Rusty and I started our own company to do this sort of research and do this sort of publishing. It was the first Epsilon Theory we wrote after starting our company in 2018. And it, for me, this one kind of hit home because I grew up in Birmingham, Alabama. I was born in 1964, which is the same year that you had the tragic bombing of the Southside Church in Birmingham. So as you know, Birmingham was a real epicenter of the civil rights movement. And one of the things that hit me as an adult was I grew up in Birmingham in the 60s. I didn't know there was a civil rights movement. I didn't know anything about it. I was never exposed to it. It was never not part of my world. And so I was trying to figure out, well, I was trying to figure out was why wasn't my father part of this? It's really what I was trying to figure out. Because God, my father hated George Wallace and that whole crew. I mean, he absolutely just detested that whole crew. And so I was trying to figure out, well, why wasn't I exposed to it? Why wasn't my father part of it? And so I went and looked at the language, again, the nudging that was done around the civil rights movement. And what I found, and again, this is before Rusty and I developed real tools to measure this with a lot of specificity, which is what we want to show today. But what I found was that in the news of the day, the way in which Martin Luther King Jr. and the movement was presented in the newspapers, which my father would have read, is that they were presented as criminals. They were presented as criminals. Now, they were presented as criminals for crimes that today we say, well, that's not a crime. But arguably, it wasn't a crime back then either to say, no, we're advocating that you should not ride the Montgomery city buses. Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested, tried, and convicted on criminal conspiracy for his words to boycott the Montgomery bus system. He was sentenced to a year of hard labor and $1,000 fine. That was the sentence. You can't make this stuff up. So just advocating, no, you shouldn't eat lunch at Rich's in Atlanta. That was a crime. And the presentation was that these were criminals and they were convicted as such. So the impact for my father, I mean, yes, he couldn't stand George Wallace and he was very suspicious of the state, but he wasn't going to be associated with criminals. That was so antithetical to who he was. So I'm glad you brought both of these up because in my professional career and then in just my life, kind of looking back at my own life, I've seen this happen before. What I think we're going to be able to describe to you here in terms of how National Guard deployments into U.S. cities are being just not described, but prescribed for the American people.
Rusty, you're going to tell me what you thought about that, but I have to bring something up that I've heard you say. I know you've said this offline. I don't know if you've said this in public. You've talked about author motivations here, how Ben just laid it out in terms of a Chekhov's gun almost.
Mm.
Could you introduce that here? I think it's very relevant to what Ben just said, and then reflect on what he said a minute for us.
Yeah, there's a famous remark from the famous playwright Anton Chekhov, which describes this Chekhov's gun, this idea that if you introduce a gun in the first act, you have to fire it by the end of the third act. And this idea is that it's meant to be a bit of writers' counsel and actors' counsel for people who are putting on productions and plays or writing them, that including details that are not relevant to the plot is not necessarily useful. But I think it's also a useful way of thinking about some of our more colorful politicians. And I think it's not just politicians; it's executives of anyone who is in that business of trying to create or promote a specific way of telling a story about their company, their country, or something going on in the world, promoting a narrative. And it looks very much like a Chekhov's gun. And for many of these people, if they're going to introduce a narrative or a framing or an idea in the first act, you can be pretty confident by the end of the third act that it's going to be fired, right? And I think we found that useful in a lot of the research we've done on narrative formation when there is a very clear kind of first act to a process. And I think, as we'll kind of talk about, a presidential election cycle has a very clear first act, right, before the election is over, where, beyond the sort of mealy-mouthed promises that politicians always make, there are sort of jarring out of the blue statements or claims or ideas that get promoted that I think are worth tracking, simply because in many cases, I think they turn out to be Chekhov's guns, things that will absolutely be fired by the end of the third act.
Is this the point where we get really concerned by the hatchet?
I was just going to say, we've got the axe, on the mantle.
Chekhov's axe. Actually, no, interestingly, so we're in New England. That is an axe that my son made from an old axe head that he found buried in our yard with his metal detector, and managed to craft himself a little haft to put in it, and assembled it. I thought it was beautiful enough and cool enough to display, and also needed to put it somewhere where he couldn't get it because it's not stable. And I definitely do not want it to be fired by the third axe, because that axe head would fly off.
Let's not fire the axe today. Let's go to these signatures. You identified 5. You pulled these out of, maybe Rusty, just for a second, say what sort of, where this signature came from, or where these 5 signatures came from. Talk about the Perscient database, and then let's go through each of the 5 just at a high level first.
Yeah, well, and a little bit of a background here, because to let you a little bit into our thought process. Some of you may remember back in the first quarter of this year of 2025, we published a piece about the narratives around tariffs. And it wasn't specifically narratives around just tariffs. It was narratives justifying tariffs, because it had occurred to us that we were hearing what sounded like a kind of scattershot or steady progression of different explanations for why tariffs were needed. Right? Some of you may recall at a certain point it was, well, we need to stop drugs from getting over the border from Canada and Mexico, and so we need tariffs. It's going to stop, all of the fentanyl from getting across the border. Then there was, we need other countries to pay their fair share. America's bearing too much of the global financial burden. Then it's, we need to reshore manufacturing, or we need to protect domestic industry, or actually it's going to replace the income tax, or, other countries are taking advantage of us. That's to say that, many things are overdetermined, and if you're making a justification for things, there's often multiple reasons. But there was definitely a progression of hey, which of these is working, and which of these is resonating most with news media and the general populace. So we wrote a piece about it, and we developed an analysis that would show kind of how those narratives rose and fell over the course of the period before the election and through kind of the middle of this year, when we had kind of a heightened conversation about tariffs. And I think over the course of the last several weeks, Ben and I both, in talking about this question of National Guard deployments, kind of were starting to get the impression that something similar was happening. When we would hear the news and we would hear the reasons described for why it was necessary to deploy the National Guard to various American cities, the explanations seemed similar but distinct in a way that we thought was measurable. So does it make sense for me to talk a little bit about our semantic signature technology and what I mean by measuring these narratives?
I really think you should, because I think that's important in the testing of, we're putting a lot of different guns on the stage basically and saying, would you like if I fired this one?
Exactly. So in short, a semantic signature is a quantitative measure of the presence of a story, of its rise and its fall. Well, obviously stories are not numbers. And so what we actually do, and this is core to our business here at Perscient, we create language models which relate to each of these narratives. We define their parameters, and then we use AI tools to search massive blocks of data for those definitions that we've given to these stories. So we're essentially asking these large language models to explore, say, millions, but it's actually billions, tens of billions of tokens of unstructured data from news, transcripts, press releases, Substacks, blogs, Reddit, threads, social media. We're looking at all those things and we're asking it to identify whether each, little blocks of text within each of those articles match the definitions of a narrative that we've described and we've defined. And we define these in a pretty nuanced fashion. So in this case, I think when we put our heads together, there were 5 narratives about the justification of the deployment of the National Guard that we thought it was worth defining and then measuring and tracking. So just walking through them in no real order, the second signature we wanted to track was that the National Guard is needed because crime is out of control in some American cities, right? So there might be some overlap between those, right? Because violent migrants is implying the presence of criminal activity or maybe describing it explicitly, but they are distinct. They're similar but distinct. And this one is, hey, crime in American cities is out of control. Police aren't doing anything about it. So we're going to, send the National Guard to do something about it, which has kind of a slightly overlapping third narrative or third semantic signature, which is that the National Guard needs to be deployed because Democratic leaders, whether governors or mayors, refuse to do their jobs. Right. This is, I think all of us have heard of these 3 kind of in sometimes in conjunction with one another, but sometimes independently. But I think we wanted to track these nuances a little bit separately. The fourth is that the National Guard must be deployed to protect federal facilities and federal agents and employees. So a little bit different and something that we didn't necessarily see early on in the process. The final one, which I say final, but I think as we're going to get back to, this is the Chekhov's gun, is that the National Guard is needed to stop domestic and in particular left-wing or far-left terrorism. So it's a group of related and probably overlapping in some cases narratives, but really interesting once you drill down to actually see when they rise and fall and in what order and how that's taking place.
Ben, any comment on just the nuance in the language of each of these?
Well, this is what has been the quantum leap forward that we've been able to accomplish in the technology from when I was first scratching at this 35 years ago. I mean, it seems crazy to talk about this now, but that getting to war work that we were talking about earlier, I mean, this was reading newspaper editorials by hand and just what's possible today in terms of the scale and in terms of the technology. It allows for this sort of resolution to make the distinction between these different narrative rationales, the specifics of the nudge. And it's personally gratifying, but I think for all of us, it's so useful because it allows us to have a much more focused response. It allows us, it's not trying to predict the future. I mean, we're talking about Chekhov's gun and yeah, if the rationale is there, it's going to be used, it's going to be fired. It's not so much about predicting the future as it is about really understanding the present. And that's what I think is it's such, the work that I was able to do as an academic was basically historical analysis after the fact, able to analyze things pretty closely. What's possible today is to analyze in real time what's actually happening now. And that is so powerful to figure out our reaction is, how to prepare for it. We're able to prepare for the future because we're able to see the present so much more clearly than I think we ever have been in the past.
Well, you love to quote that old Sorosism that I'm not predicting, I'm observing.
Yeah, so I hate to say that that's for George Soros anymore because he's one of the boogeymen, of course.
I know,
but it's just but it's such an important thing to observe.
And I think that nuance, and I'll give an example of it here before I turn it back to Matt. But that nuance you can actually see in some of the financial services examples I might give around, for example, something like central bank policy. On the one hand, you have people who are, taking Fed minutes and conducting, sentiment analysis where a nice word gets a +1 and a mean word or a negative word gets a -1 and you score it and come up with a result. We're not doing anything like that, right? What we're doing is looking at the nuance between 7 different ways of framing the same idea. Like, for example, you could say that the Fed must tighten. You could say that markets expect that the Fed will tighten. You could say that the Fed is on its way to tightening. You could say the Fed has stayed dovish for too long. You could say the Fed is losing credibility. You could say the Fed is emphasizing or will emphasize inflation more in its going forward work. Right? There are 12 different ways of framing this very similar idea, or something that conveys something similar, and seeing some of those differences underneath the surface in real time really does give you a much more accurate picture of the present, where we're at in cycles and processes. It has been really useful to us in our work there, but it's also really useful to some of the social and cultural analysis that we do here.
What I love about that is you're going to take us right into this next part with this idea here, Rusty, because it's how, when you score out all those ideas, you can start to see what's starting to catch and how it's catching. And that is not sentiment analysis at all when you see it laid out this way. Let's start with this timeline walkthrough.
Yeah. So I think
break this down.
So here, what you see on this screen is the density, a measure of how, of all the words you would be reading about, the deployment of the National Guard, or about civil unrest, or about, American communities, how much of that language is dense with passages that reflect this narrative, right? And in this case, we're plotting one narrative. So on this chart, what you're seeing is the narrative that the National Guard is needed to stop left-wing terrorism. And interestingly, while this is the most recent spike, and you see that on the far right, that's over the last, call it 3 to 5 weeks, you've seen this really sharp spike in the density of that language, but you actually see it present quite some time ago. You see it present in October of 2024. This was the first of these narratives to really rise out of nothing, right? No one was talking about deploying the National Guard prior to, at any reasonable time horizon over the last couple of years, until this October moment in 2024. And it was this narrative, not crime out of control, not so much illegal immigrants or the need to, use these federal agents for immigration enforcement, but specifically to deal with left-wing terrorism. So it was actually October 13th of 2024. Donald Trump got on, I think it was a Fox News interview. And you may recall, started talking about, we've got some sick people, radical left lunatics, and all these issues. I'm paraphrasing, it should be handled very easily by the National Guard, or if really necessary, by the military. And to be clear, at this point, even at this point, while, Antifa, for example, or rioters were certainly in the crosshairs, he's talking about Adam Schiff here, right? The people who were the enemy within, you might remember that phraseology from back in October. These are the people being characterized as left-wing terrorists and radicals that needed to be stopped by the National Guard. They were Democrats and people in office and public officials that would ultimately become unseated when Donald Trump was elected president. So it was talking about left-wing terrorists, but I want to be clear: the Chekhov's gun that we had here was not necessarily confined to Antifa or violent protesters or rioters. It was people who were seen as political enemies within the Democratic political party and within the administration that under Joe Biden. So that spike you see, that hump in October and November of 2024, was the start of this language. And it was, of all the National Guard language, we started with the terrorism narrative. And then it disappeared.
Ben, when you look at that hump and you think back to last year, how would you explain that? And is that sort of we know the direction we want to go in, or we're choosing to go in, and now we're testing the language around what works, and that's part of why we're revisiting that language now? Or would you frame that a different way?
I don't think so. I don't think there was a full-fledged plan, although there could be, and this is the Project 2025. So, I mean, I think there are a lot of people who have plans. And this is true for whether you're talking about war plans or political plans. Lots of people have plans. I think that what this demonstrated is when this trial balloon, when this language was floated, was that it had some legs. It got picked up. I think that's the thing here. I don't think there was some grand plan in October 24, at least not a cemented grand plan. Oh, we're going to send the troops into cities, and that's what we're going to do. But I do think that you try a lot of trial balloons, and an effective politician particularly tries a lot of different words in different language to see what sticks. And so that's what I get from October 24. Because look, Trump says a lot of things that get a news play for a day and don't really get picked up. They're stuck around for a little while. To Rusty's point, it goes away because there was nothing really to sustain it in terms of applying the language. Other things were happening, like the election and the aftermath of the election. But you asked, that's what I guess it got some play. And I don't think that went unnoticed for the future developments for this narrative.
Yeah. And I think it's not just whether, you throw something and it sticks. I think, as we'll see, it's, whether the universe provides you with an opportunity to make it.
Yes.
Right. And as any of us with a, portfolio of different kinds of positions, some of those positions we think about as things where, look, if things play out this way, I have this thing ready to go. I've got this contingency plan that works really well. And a lot of those Chekhov's guns look like contingency plans. It's hey, I'm gonna hang this thing up on the wall. I'm gonna tell you about it. And maybe if things play out this way, it creates an opportunity for me to use it. And it's helpful that I, kind of saw if it stuck or if it, yielded a lot of resistance. So
a technical detail question for you, Rusty. The current higher high than October, what's actually going on in the data that tells us this has reached a higher high now versus where it was in October of 2024?
Just it really is a higher density of the language discussing the National Guard and their deployments is language that is specifically referring to an argument being made by somebody that it is justified because of left-wing terrorists, left-wing radicals, and this is a raw density that you're seeing here. So it is if you read if you read every word there was to read right now about National Guard deployments, and you went back to October of 2024 and read every word at that time that you could read about it, you would be twice as likely now to read words that told you, hey, we should totally deploy the National Guard to defeat these radical left-wing terrorists.
I want to use that to segue into the next timeline here. So this is a timeline of to get rid of violent illegals and narco-terrorists. And we have a couple of signatures on this chart. Rusty, start by telling us what's going on here.
Yeah, so I went ahead and kept the first ones just so you can have the point of comparison and kind of see the relative density. So even when he was floating some of those ideas, it got play. But you see that green hump now here, and we're comparing it to some of these others. It only got so much play. These things definitely need to be seen on the relative scales in which they exist. So reading this chart, just so you understand, each of these are not stacked. So these are, as an area chart, these should be looked at independently. So if one of them is higher than the other, that means it is more dense than the other. So we're plotting here 3 different semantic signatures. The one about the terrorism, left-wing terrorism justification. We've also added 2 more. The one about illegals and narco-terrorists. And we also added the one about protecting federal facilities. So the first thing you see is that for the kind of January, February, March period of the post-inauguration, and actually leading up to the inauguration, we were already starting to see some of the expectation that the National Guard would be called in to, whether it was defend the border or to assist in some of ICE and DHS's activities in American cities as part of immigration enforcement and removal. So a lot of those conversations were going on at a moderate clip. You see it in that little hump for about 4 months or 3 months in that reddish hued exhibit here, and then kind of went away. And it went away for the most part until about June 6th. So as you may recall, and that's where you see that almost straight up line for 3 of these narratives. So June 6th, these were, if you may recall, the ICE raids that took place in Los Angeles. They sparked widespread protests, some bordering on riots that broke out on the 7th. So pretty quickly, you saw each of these 3 narratives rise very quickly, but the one that rose the most quickly was the one about the protection of federal facilities, right? So, in this case, it was really important. If you wanted to make a Title X justification for the deployment of the National Guard, there had to be this justification of there being a rebellion, domestic violence, or insurrection, right? Because the Posse Comitatus Act does not permit the use of the National Guard or the military for law enforcement, with a couple of exceptions, right? And rebellion, domestic violence, or insurrection happens to be one of those exceptions. We're going to hear about another one here in a minute. And so makes a lot of sense that if you want to deploy the National Guard, not only do you need to tell the story that, hey, we are trying to deport these violent illegal immigrants or these violent migrants, these narco-terrorists, we're trying to take care of this. And we can't without the National Guard's help. Now, that being kind of a law enforcement question, you need that additional narrative of, hey, you realize they're attacking federal facilities. And there were absolutely events, right? I mean, during this window, you may recall that there was a, kind of disappeared from the news, but there was a shooting at, I think, an ICE facility in Dallas that took place a couple of weeks after this. There were cases where there were assaults and rumored assaults on agents of ICE. So again, when we talk about a narrative, don't take the pejorative sense that I think a lot of people mean, which is a lie or a fabrication. We say it without affect, right? A narrative is a framing of a story without regard to whether that is true or not. So don't mistake me there. But it was a very useful narrative for anyone who wanted a Title X justification for the deployment of the National Guard, which ultimately happened and caused the government to deploy the National Guard to Los Angeles. And that was by far the densest narrative over that period of time, that we need to protect our federal officers as we try to root out these violent migrants. So it's a bit of, you see a little bit of both. Some of this is reporting, some of this is framing, and then some of it is very clearly, hey, the most important narrative here is the one that actually allows us to do this legally, and we most need to establish, which is this idea that federal facilities are coming under assault from violent left-wing rioters.
Ben, your thoughts are how you would parse that, the levels of framing there, because I think that's really interesting when we look at this chart.
Yeah, I think something that Rusty was saying is really important here. There is truth with a little t in all, I'd say almost all narratives. Right? There is, right? There is, a crime problem in cities. There are assaults on federal personnel and property. All these things are true. And yet, right? And yet it's why I think that looking at density is so important, because it's showing you, yes, there is an element of truth, but then the story creates a truth of its own. And there are lots of true things that happen, where you don't get the density of words. And so it's as if it never happened. So this is something that I know Rusty and I wrestle with a lot when when we use that word narrative, because it has taken on, to Rusty's point, this a pejorative. Oh, that's just your narrative, man. You're just making this up. And that's why we prefer our terminology of a semantic signature, meaning that it's a story separate from the little t truth that they have sparked the story in the first place or kept it going. But there are lots of little t truths that don't have stories associated with them, or stories that don't take off for whatever reason. And it's that for whatever reason that we're really interested in. Is it because it's being presented to us as a way of thinking about the world? That's what I personally think is happening here. I think there's an intentionality behind which of these stories gets that oomph and that magnification and that repetition. But it doesn't mean that there's no accuracy or truth to it. It can also mean that just because something does it doesn't mean that there is accuracy and a lot of truth to it. It's really a wholly separate dimension, which I think describes our world pretty well, that our world, we call it fiat world, it's a world by declaration, where the reality seems to be presented more by the strength of storytelling than by the frequency of actual true events. And it's that former that we're trying to pick up here, the strength of the storytelling. That's all.
Take us, Rusty, through your part 3 here. To stop a crime wave. What's going on in this one?
So one of the interesting things about the last chart that you may have noticed is that for almost anything, there's a news cycle that is predictably rarely longer than a month. So even on something like this, once a framing has been out there, once a semantic signature has established that kind of high density, it kind of falls away just about as quickly as it rose. And we see that time and time again, that shelf or that kind of plateau shape is extremely common. And it's very common that I think we wrote one time that the half-life of almost any news story is, 14 to 28 days. And I think that, we see that in the data here. It kind of fell off very quickly. And so there really was a period, believe it or not, in August when we weren't talking about this very much. There wasn't that much going on in the world of, hey, should we deploy the National Guard to achieve some social end? And then, and I would say that, whereas there was a clear event that precipitated the deployment of the National Guard to Los Angeles, right? There were protests and riots that took place after a major ICE raid. For this next one, there really wasn't. So on August, I think it was 8, President Trump, kind of out of the blue, decided that Washington, D.C. was undergoing an unprecedented crime wave. And the only way to deal with it was to bring in the National Guard. And he did. And he brought them in quite quickly. Now, I don't think it's worth us getting into a reported crime rate discussion. Certainly most statistics show that DC, while a pretty crime-ridden city all considered, has actually gotten a little bit better. The usual response from people is, oh, well, they don't report those crimes. But then you look at the crimes that they always report, like murder. Kind of hard to hide murder in your crime statistics. Those have gotten better too. Be that as it may, the president determined that we need to deploy the National Guard to fight this complete and total lawlessness, as he described it, in Washington, D.C. And this is kind of a different case, right? Because the president, for the Los Angeles justification, needed to to make this sort of Title X argument that there's rebellion, domestic violence, or insurrection going on. And he didn't really have to do that here, so you don't see that narrative, right? You don't see media propagating this idea nearly as much over this period that you needed to, bring in the National Guard, because there was a rebellion, domestic violence, or insurrection going on. He didn't need to make that argument because there's a specific case for DC where Trump could activate Section 740 of the DC Home Rule Act. Not that it had ever been done before, but it was possible under the DC Home Rule Act for the federal government to deploy and military assets and the National Guard in some of those capacities. And so he was able to do it. And the discussion about it ramped up quickly and actually kind of stuck around for a long time. And part of the reason it stuck around for a long time is that because it was a pretty, relative to some of the other things, was pretty popular. Because people, I think, if you follow along on social media and writers from the political right wing, there were a lot of people doing the sort of walkarounds of DC and saying, I can finally walk around my neighborhood again. Thank you, Trump administration. And seemed like there was kind of a concerted effort, but I think that relative to other uses that seemed somewhat more oppressive, using it in a way that didn't come under immediate legal scrutiny and threat, or at least not as strong of legal scrutiny and threat, there wasn't as much for people to write about it other than we don't think the National Guard should be deployed like this, until it started to veer into, okay, well, next we're going to go to Chicago, and then we're going to go to Memphis, and then we're going to go to all these cities. DC was just a test case, and we're going to do all those others. And so what you see on the chart here, where we don't see that, immediate decay after 14 to 20 days, it continues, is because it's not because the DC conversation stayed. It's because it's shifted to, okay, here, this process, we're going to go to all these other different markets and think about it. And so you get this continual flow of news. It does eventually die down, but that's because something else happened that we can talk about in a minute. But the crime wave, but definitely different from the conversation and the narratives that were being discussed about National Guard deployment after the LA ICE protests.
Hey, Matt, you know how I said that for that October 24 statement about, we got to do something about the left-wing terrorists, that was just, that there wasn't really any direction for that statement.
You're beating me to my question that I have for you on this. Perfect.
My view, based on studying this stuff for a long time, is that from June onwards, a decision was made that we are going to deploy federalized National Guard troops into American cities. And that what you've seen since then is like jurisdiction shopping when you've got a court case you want to bring. You're narrative shopping. You're trying different rationales on for size to see, do they have legs? Do you get court challenges? Do you get popular support for what you're doing? And they can exist contemporaneously. You're not saying, I have to pick one, but you are saying to reach this, as Rusty's saying, that Title X justification, that's a pretty high bar. So it makes sense on this crime wave. We're going to start off with a place where we don't have to have that, Washington, D.C. Now let's see if we can extend it to other cities. So my strong view is the decision was made in early June. We want to deploy federalized National Guard troops into American cities, Democrat cities. Let's see how we can make that happen. And trying out these different narratives is how you do it. And to Rusty's point, this was a good one for them. This is a good one for the White House.
It was a good one, but I also think it, as things move from DC to other cities, you started to get more of the conversation taking the form of constitutional arguments, judges saying, no, you can't do that. you started, what you started to get back into the legal and the resistance from, I think, more people. Chicago's kind of an interesting case, right? Because as we think about semantic signatures, even today, if you ask people to give their archetypal example of a city that just has a ton of murders and a corrupt
Chicago.
Political structure that doesn't want to do anything about it because they're so obsessed with ultra leftist politics, everyone's going to say Chicago. And they wouldn't be wrong. At least in my opinion, right?
Again,
it is
there's that truth to it. Yes.
It is a terribly run city that has had way too much crime, way too many murders, far too long, that seems completely unwilling to do anything about a gang problem that's been there since I lived in a Chicago suburb in the early 80s. So, again, there's a reality to a lot of that, where I think that by going from DC to Chicago, they're able to capitalize on that semantic signature being pretty much common knowledge. Everyone kind of knows, oh yeah, it's just Chicago. That's a problem.
But it still doesn't get you over the Title 10
It doesn't.
justification.
And I think you found yourself at a place in early September where Portland, okay, people remember the Antifa stuff a little from 28 and 21. Most normies have kind of forgotten. They wouldn't associate it with Portland. All of us who are very online and kind of focused on politics do remember. But outside of that, other than maybe San Francisco, because, conservatives love to hate on San Francisco, and it's got problems. I don't think there's really another city where you wouldn't start to run into a little bit of resistance. And so that's where we found ourselves as we came into early September, is some of that resistance building a little bit.
Jump right to it. Part 4 here, left-wing terrorists, because September was you couldn't have predicted this exactly coming.
No.
This feeds into these density scores pretty dramatically. Tell us what happened.
Well, hopefully everyone remembers what happened. I think it was September 10th. And that's the day that, you can call him a terrorist or not, but a murderer and assassin killed Charlie Kirk. And I think that was, when we think about timing, was literally exactly as the various arguments for National Guard deployment were starting to come under their strongest resistance. And so I've got a chart up here, the actual event, right? Because the spike in the terrorist argument, that framing did not happen until a couple of weeks later, right? That line does not start to rise until late September. Early September, however, is that last gold peak, right? Is it before it starts to go down, right? The city arguments, right as the assassination of Charlie Kirk took place, the idea of that it made sense to be deploying the National Guard to American cities was falling, not rising, and it actually continued falling after the assassination until, and I think it was on right around September 24th, 26th, when President Trump gave his reason for what was going to be the deployment of the National Guard to Portland. So in this late September declaration, where he says, Antifa and the radical left anarchists have been viciously attacking our federal law enforcement officers, right? You're still getting, right, that language of, hey, we need to satisfy Title 10 requirements for the deployment. And we are now calling this, we're not only calling it an insurrection and a rebellion from the left wing, we're also calling it domestic terror, right? So this is it was with that announcement that Antifa, or immediately following it, that Antifa was designated a thing that does not exist, which is a domestic terror organization or domestic terrorist organization. That's not a thing, but it was useful in narrative space. And so when you brought in that terrorist language, it spiked immediately, hard. It's as sharp as any of the things here. And I've showed this in the Z-score space, so you can see in the other ones were just raw density. This is density relative to historical averages. And so it gives you a sense of just how sharp that move was for this semantic signature that we need to deploy the National Guard to defeat these far left terrorists and anarchists. That, as you recall, this is the language, but a little different from the language that was put forth back in, I October of 2024. Now, obviously, there's no way Donald Trump could have predicted that something as tragic as the murder of Charlie Kirk would take place. But again, it does kind of get back to why you think about having so many of those Chekhov's guns mounted on the wall, right? Because the universe does hand you tragedies like that, whether it was COVID, right? Back in the day. And I think we could do a very similar analysis of the ways that the Faucis and others of the world had probably had very similar Chekhov's guns that got fired as soon as you have this pandemic. It's like, okay, now's the opportunity to fire those guns. But I actually make the argument to you here, and I'm kind of curious what Ben thinks about this. That gun hasn't been fired yet, right? We're ramping up the discussion of, hey, we need to deploy the National Guard to clamp down on these left-wing terrorists and Antifa and people who are destroying American cities. But when you look back at October 2024, it wasn't just Antifa. It wasn't the actual far left-wing terrorists that were being referenced. It was apparatchiks and officials and people within the Democratic Party who had expressed certain views, right? And that gun has not yet really been fired. At least that's my opinion. But it kind of feels like it's on a continuum toward being fired, but being fired based on how much that terrorist language is really being thrown around.
Yeah, and not just terrorist language thrown around, guys with black umbrellas and, Portland, but for very mainstream Democratic Party officials and supporters. So that it just seems to me just as clear as day. That's where all of this is going. What I referenced earlier about the civil rights movement. So a political opposition to the incumbent is going to be criminalized. And it happens on the margins at first. It happens from donations to a political action committee, to a PAC, to a campaign that puts you on the watch list to get your taxes audited. Right? It goes down the way of, yes, we'll find a reason to have federalized National Guard troops in Chicago and Philadelphia, New York, if Mamdani is elected. Following on, we're going to stop all Washington programs for money coming into New York City. And if there's a problem with that, well, we need to send in the troops. I think it's all of a part. It's all of a piece. And it's all of a political piece. That's my view.
I think you see some of the early signs of some of the criminalization. And I don't think I feel as strongly about that necessarily being as fully fledged a direction as we're headed. But I can observe, for example, that, people at protests, and I am distinguishing these from riots, right? These are valid protests that are not infringing on the space or the federal property. They're not in any conceivable way impeding federal officers, law enforcement officers from doing their jobs. People are being arrested or detained for taking video of events, and it being said, hey, you're interfering or impeding a law enforcement operation, right? And I don't think it's the first time that kind of thing has been done, nor is it the only administration under which it's been done. But that is one of the early instances of, I think, criminalization that we're starting to see, right? Is that if you are protesting ICE or if you are protesting these activities, you are de facto un-American and treasonous and maybe even a terrorist. And, well, you videoed us and that, we didn't like that very much, or, I didn't like your unicorn costume or whatever it was you were wearing in Portland, and we're going to detain you. And there's enough videos of those things taking place that I think you are seeing some signs of that criminalization. I'm wondering, Ben, do you think this is literal criminalization, or chilling that is sort of a de facto criminalization, right? I could see there being chilling effects to the threat, to deployments and threats of deployments. Do you think it has to be explicit, or could it just end up in that chilling effect or de facto criminalization from these deployments?
Well, you have to make the credible claim that there are criminals. Right? It's just like with Martin Luther King Jr. There had to be a statute on the books that it is a criminal conspiracy to advocate for the boycotting of a bus system.
Right.
But the goal, Rusty, to your point, is not to arrest either the ringleaders or the person who's there actually protest. That's not the goal of any of this. The goal of any of this is to have a chilling effect on the broad public who might be otherwise quite sympathetic. And it's why, honestly, I thought the Three Kings efforts this past weekend, I thought one of the reasons they were effective in bringing out a lot of people who were loosely affiliated is that they were not characterized as protests.
Yeah.
They were explicitly characterized not as a protest, but as a gathering. And I think that was smart, necessary, etc. But this is how the battle lines get drawn. To the degree it's a protest and there is ostensibly a crime that can be plausibly claimed to have been committed there. That was the goal in the 1960s. I think that's the goal today, because you just want the broad majority of people, you just want them to sit down. You just want them to stay out. Because if it's just you and the usual suspects at these protests, well, that plays pretty well, or that doesn't play terribly badly, let's say.
Yeah.
Now that's what I think. But yes, I think there has to be, and there is looking for ostensibly criminal behavior so that you can present the organization and the impetus as a whole as criminalized.
Rusty, the density and being an indication of where we were told we needed to end up. This is sort of that push of measuring these things where we go, there's an awareness to these spikes in density. Why is that so useful to see in this visual format or be able to track?
Well, because I think, as we've written a lot of times, narratives are the water in which we swim. Right? We don't really have a good sense of them other than this sort of uncomfortable back of our head sense that this story sure seems like it's being fed to me a lot right now. And I think being able to articulate very clearly, even if you don't have a clear action, simply knowing, wow, this is really, really being promoted quite heavily, that there are terrorists in our midst and we need to do something about them. And look, I don't think it should be lost on anyone, whether they're on the maybe somewhat left of center side of the spectrum, like my counterpart here, or on the right of center part of the spectrum, like myself. We're simultaneously grappling with the question of extrajudicial killings of so-called terrorist, organizations, and these are true foreign terrorist organizations as they've been designated, in the Caribbean, right, where we're firing weapons at ships that historically would have been law enforcement operations that would have been apprehended and prosecuted under, drug smuggling charges. And so, it's not hard to get a little bit uncomfortable thinking about a world where the semantic signatures describing a wider swath of Americans as terrorists is rising rapidly and becoming a denser part of the language that exists around us, at the same time as our government is electing to establish the precedent that has the right to kill terrorists. And there absolutely has been chatter about adding Antifa to the foreign terrorist organization list. I don't think it's happened yet. And I think it would be very difficult given that it's mostly a bunch of, decently funded, maladapted LARPers from the West Coast who, probably have enough money from their parents' trust funds to permit them the protest and riot lifestyle for, some extended period of time. Ben and I have frequently described these Antifa numbskulls as LARPers, as people who want to go out there and pretend like they're actually fighting the fascists just so they can bust down the window of a Starbucks. And yet they're to define them and to call that, a terrorist act, and then to start seeing the signs and early bits of evidence that maybe it isn't just going to be the Antifas, but it's going to be anyone who does protest. And maybe it goes just from anyone who protests to anyone whose vote, wasn't correct, right? Which you're seeing that in our visa applications, where if your phone showed that you voted correctly or incorrectly, or if you had the right or wrong opinions about Charlie Kirk, then it's going to impact whether you can get into the country. I don't think it's unreasonable for people to worry about the confluence of all those things, meaning that telling them that this density rising is going to start encompassing a greater number of people that go beyond actual rioters and people doing damage, even beyond protesters, to normal people who just have their own opinions.
Ben, you started worried about your dad, and not worried about your dad, thinking about your dad in the Letters from a Birmingham Museum, and just what was the water in which he was swimming at the time, and why weren't you aware of it as a child growing up in that setting? How do you think tools like this, how are your kids going to look at the tools like this that you're generating now and think about you with that same time lag?
I think that one of the enormous advantages of the tools we've built and the general awareness that you are being nudged and you are being influenced by social media, by mainstream media, by all of it, is that there is actually a lot more critical distance that most people take with the messages that they get. I mean, we all get infected by it, but particularly my children, they've got some critical distance, I find, with the media. It's always 2 steps forward and 1 step back, but I do think that there is an awareness of the media system today and the way that it's being used to push us and nudge us in certain directions. I really think that's true. And I think everyone listening to this podcast who reads Epsilon Theory is thinking about these sort of issues, wherever you are on the political spectrum, right? And please God, it's not like Donald Trump invented this sort of stuff. But I'll end with this. In my experience, professional and personal, governments and corporations don't engage in a massive advertising campaign, because that's what this is. Costly, takes a lot of resources. You don't do it because you're waiting to see, well, let's see how it turns out. You do it because you've already made a decision that this is the direction you're going to go, and here's how we're going to bring the public along to support the decision we've already made. So that's why I see this as more than troubling. It puts us on a clear path, I think, for what's ahead.
There's all sorts of charts. There's all sorts of data that you guys have put together that people can explore. Ben, if people want to find out more, they want to dig into some of this stuff themselves, where are you pointing them these days?
Well, Epsilon Theory is always there for you, and that's it's out there in a lot of places, on Twitter, on the website, and the like. Our company is Perscient, and that's where you're going to find the technology that we're showing. We publish it on Epsilon Theory, And starting next week, we'll be starting it on a new site called Panoptica. So more to come.
Much, much more to come indeed. Ben and Rusty, thanks so much for the time.
Thank you, Matt.
Thanks, Matt.